of the art colony as a huge boutique, postmodernism and designer genes happened to other places, like this part of Paris around Les Halles. It was bulldozed flat in the 1970s to make room for a development whose core was the Pompidou Centre. The centre opened in 1977. If the monument at the start of modernism was the Eiffel Tower, this is the one at its end. A palace of French centralisation, a cross between a Piranesi prison and a construction toy. It's a very metaphorical building, and although those pipes and ventilators stop practically all natural light from getting in, which is quite a trick in a metal and glass structure, they do suggest industrial process, like an oil refinery. In the 1920s, Russian constructivist architects designed palaces of culture, which were never built. This Marxist ideal of the museum as a social condenser was only translated into fact in capitalist Paris 60 years later. And for blocks around, the quarter has been gutted and remade in the French version of the Soho mix, full of little galleries selling little art and neat studio apartments for young trendies. Where the belly of Paris used to be, Culture Gulch now stands. If anyone had suggested 30 years ago that the fallout from modern art would produce such mutations, nobody would have believed it. This is what happens when big concentrations of social interests decide to use modern art as their aiming point. And the irony is that the institutional triumph of the new happens just when the old social uses of art, whose residue gave the idea of the avant-garde its meaning, have almost withered away.
Alors, messieurs, dames, depuis constaté par vous-même, il vient de se faire enchaîner.
In the 15th century, one of these uses was to inform and to explain.
Where did you get your information about the world and its history and how to live in it? Well, not from magazines or newspapers, because they didn't exist. And not from books either, because in the 15th century the idea of mass printing was hardly even an idea. 500 years ago, you and I probably would have been completely illiterate. This left two other channels of information. One was the spoken word, and that included everything from village pump gossip to the high rhetoric of the altar and the pulpit. And the other one was visual images, painting and sculpture. Of these, painting was the more eloquent, with its much greater power of visual illusion and its adaptability to almost any given surface. This chapel in the church of San Clemente in Rome was painted by an artist named Masolino de Panicale. Now, 500 years later, we can look at his work with a tourist's eye or with an art historian's, but the one thing we cannot do is see it with the eye of his own audience. Because that eye supposed, as our culture no longer does, that painting was one of the primary dominant forms of public speech. Painting explains and describes, and here it describes a legend. The task of painting was to make it vivid and tangible and credible, to insert the legend into the life of a group of people who gathered here so that it would strengthen their faith and alter their beliefs, and so compel behaviour. Now that, as I understand it, is what public art fundamentally has always been about. But today we have no credible public art because other media have taken its old power away.
Throughout its history, up to the end of the 19th century, art kept this didactic purpose. It showed people what to worship, what to pray to, whom to believe, what values to adopt. It was the main generator of social symbols. Today, the whole issue of the use of public art is in question, but most of the time our ancestors simply assumed that it was the main purpose of painting. The object could be tiny and precious, like a religious icon, or it could be as big as David's Oath of the Horatii, which was a political icon meant to teach republican virtue to the French. We know that art is about pleasure too, and fear, and tranquil meditation beyond politics, and a host of other things as wide as the range of human feeling itself. But up to the end of the 19th century, the importance of art was usually bound up with its role as public discourse. Without that role, there would have been no avant-garde, because if art doesn't embody values, then it can't act as a conscience. And that was what the avant-garde set out to be when it made its debut in the mid-19th century, the conscience of a class, its traditional enemy and chief patron, the bourgeoisie.